I studied business law because I thought I would be able to walk into a well-paid job once I had finished my university. Then I graduated and reality hit. I couldn't find work and I was spiraling deeper into debt. My rented apartment was always cold, and a dark, disgusting mold caused by dampness was spreading across the ceilings and walls. It was the pits. One gray morning, I just had to get out of the apartment for a while. I had enough money for a coffee, so I found a cafe nearby. I settled into a corner, opened up my laptop, and went back to my search for a job. The coffee tasted good. The cafe was buzzing with the conversations of the other customers, and I started to feel better. When I clicked on a post I saw about a vacancy for an assistant archivist, my mood lifted even more. The position involved cataloging and caring for an extensive collection of diverse and valuable objects held in a national archive. When I was growing up, I used to dream of working in a museum or a library. Owning a secondhand bookshop and being surrounded by dusty tomes was another daydream when I was a teenager. There was something romantic to me about old objects. They were my geeky obsession. And then I grew up and went down the path of business law. More fool me. As I read through the essential requirements for applicants to this job, and I was able to tick them all off, I started to wonder if maybe things were going to work out for the best after all. Taking my time, I worked carefully through the form. I added all the numerous details asked for, which included checks for a criminal record, and tried to sell myself on the process. "Come on, you've got to at least give me an interview," I said under my breath, and I pressed send. And then I waited. I knew that I shouldn't get my hopes up too much, but I couldn't help myself. I started constantly checking my messages for a positive response. I even did this in the middle of the night, as if some fellow insomniac who worked in personnel was going to email me at 3 in the morning. A week dragged by, and then another. I continued applying for other jobs, continued freezing my butt off and watching the mold spread, and I slowly gave up on my dream job. I mean, what had I been thinking? I was a complete loser who would die on my own, and nobody would know, until the smell got so bad that the neighbors would call the cops. They would probably find me decomposing and huddled over my laptop, still waiting for a reply. I sighed and stared at the screen, and a new email appeared. It was a reply to my application for the assistant archivist position, and they were inviting me to come for an interview. I celebrated by going for a walk and buying the cheapest drink that the coffee shop sold. The following day, I was standing in front of an anonymous-looking building on a quiet street in a business district on the outskirts of the city. This was the address that I had been given in the email, and it had not been easy to find. But I had made it, and feeling dizzy with nerves, I went in. There is a bland lobby with a reception desk next to a series of gated entrances that led through to an open space where I could see a row of elevators and a handful of people waiting by them. No one was staring at their phones like they would be everywhere else. I soon found out why. When I signed in at reception to get my visitor's pass, I was told that I had to leave my phone in a secure pouch. I would be able to get it back when I left. That struck me as overkill. I was an unemployed graduate, not a spy. And besides, what could there be here that was so secret? Wondering this, and with my visitor's pass on a lanyard around my neck, I passed through one of the gates. Close up, I could see that it was similar to a security gate at an airport, and I could tell that the receptionist was checking a monitor on their desk. No alarms went off, so that was a good start. A man was waiting for me just past the gate. He looked like a corporate type in his business suit, and I assumed that he didn't work directly with the objects in the archive. His face was as bland as the lobby, and if I had been asked afterwards to pick him out in a police lineup, I think that I would have failed. He introduced himself as Mr. Jones and said nothing else as he led me into one of the elevators. From there, we went up 2 floors and into a small, windowless office where 2 more nondescript men in suits were waiting to interview me. The interview itself felt very intrusive. I was asked about my family, my relationships, and my personal politics and beliefs before there was any mention of my degree and previous professional experience. There was no opportunity for me to ask questions, and I did not learn anything more about the archive. After I had been grilled, I was thanked and told that they would be in touch. Back out on the street, I loosened my tie and went for a walk to clear my head. I thought that I had done well at the interview, But I was no longer sure that I did want this particular job. There was nothing else on the horizon, but maybe I should focus on finding another opportunity. I was thinking this when I got home and found two separate notices that had been pushed under my door. One was from a credit card company threatening to sell my account to debt collectors. The other was from my landlord telling me that I would be evicted if I did not pay my rent. I was still standing there in a cold sweat when I heard back about the interview. They were offering me the job, and the starting salary was enough to dig me out of the hole that I was in. I forgot about all my concerns and completed the contract and non-disclosure agreement that came with it and sent them back. My hands were shaking by now, and I decided that I needed something stronger than coffee to help me calm my nerves. I had another credit card that charged insanely high interest rates, but still had a small available balance on it. So I used it to buy myself a bottle of bourbon. I still had a hangover when I started my new job 2 days later. I signed in at reception, and this time I was met beyond the gates by an older man. He had unruly white hair, looked like he had dressed in the dark, and was carrying an old leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Dr. Miller and said that he was going to be my supervisor. I followed him into an elevator, and as he pushed one of the buttons, he said with a smile, "Say goodbye to the daylight." The elevator began to descend. All of a sudden, I felt way too hot, and I could taste stale booze. I swallowed the bile that had risen into the back of my mouth and tried to look as if I was not about to pass out. I also made a solemn vow never to drink again. The elevator opened onto a dimly lit space with a high ceiling. Closed doors lined a long passageway that stretched out farther than I could see. "Welcome to the archive, Doctor," Miller said. "The administrators, the accountants, and the managers are all based on the floors above ground level, and this is where the action begins." He grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. It was my first day, and even though I still felt dreadful, I wanted to appear keen. So, I smiled back and asked, "How many levels are there down here? 35?" I was so surprised that I almost swore out loud. He must have been able to tell that I was flustered because he chuckled and said, "Oh, this place is quite the iceberg. The majority of it is below the surface and never seen apart from by the likes of you and me." And then he laughed again, and with a sweep of his hand, he indicated that I should follow him. As we walked, he talked about numbering systems, catalogues, and divisions, and subdivisions, and cross-referencing. By the time we came to a halt in front of one of the doors, my head was spinning. Dr. Miller took out a key card, pressed it against a reader to open the door, and said, "Let's get you started in here." Inside the room, dozens of shelves lined the walls, and they were all packed with old books. My inner geek punched the air and triumphed. I was still looking around in awe when I realized that Dr. Miller was speaking, and I tuned back in. He was saying the archive itself dates back to 1947. It began on a much smaller scale, and until the 1960s was held in a single warehouse. Once it outgrew those premises, it was moved here. And when the available space was again filled, it was decided to expand downwards rather than relocate. I was in the dark about so many things to do with the archive already, and the snippets that I was learning were making me feel even more ignorant. I wanted to know who was paying for all this, and how would such a sizable archive stayed under the radar for all these years. I decided to keep any more questions to myself for now, though there were clearly some serious layers of secrecy in the place here, and I didn't want to risk my new position by saying the wrong thing. Well, at least not until I had earned enough to pay off the worst of my debts. I smiled at Dr. Miller and simply nodded along as he explained what he wanted me to do first. My job as an assistant archivist began with a less than glamorous task. I was to take the books off the shelves and dust them. And along the way, if I encountered any bugs, I was to kill them. I was told that I couldn't use any kind of bug spray as this would damage the bugs, but Dr. Miller did hand over a dust mask and a stack of claws. I had more questions now. Did I get breaks? Where was the restroom? What kind of bugs might I encounter? Were they a type that were partial to people as well as paper? But I had no one to ask. Dr. Miller had left me to get on with it. I sighed and I looked at the shelves and the books. Yeah, this was going to take forever. I thought about the alternatives again. debt collectors kicking my door in unless my landlord had already thrown me out onto the street and I no longer had a door to kick in. And that gave me the motivation to get started. I removed a book, coughed and sneezed at the dust that was thrown up, and I remembered to put the mask on. The rest of that day made me forget about my hangover. Instead, I felt lousy in many other ways. My eyes were red and itchy. My back hurt from moving books. After the first 100 or so, they had started to feel like gym weights. And on this stream of bugs had also skewered over my skin and through my scalp. I was convinced that I had accidentally swallowed a few as well. By the time that Dr. Miller came to tell me I could finish work for the day, I was utterly miserable and grossed out. I caught the subway home and sat there scratching myself. The other passengers kept their distance and gave me dirty looks, and I didn't blame them. The next morning, I returned to my task, and thankfully I started to get used to the conditions. I was coughing and sneezing less and got much better at squashing bugs before they could reach me. Things improved so much that I started to check out the contents of some of the books as I took them from the shelves. There was a book about deucing, a book about cryptids that included chapters on Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, and the Jersey Devil. One of the older books was about alchemy. Another was the first in a 12-volume edition on magical curses. I also found a book about medieval justice describing in detail how to hang, draw, and quarter someone. It was not written in the style of a history book. It was much closer to a how-to guide. It was grisly and engrossing. By the end of the day, I was spending more time reading than dusting, and Dr. Miller seemed to fine with the progress that I had made. Anyway, the rest of the week passed easily enough. At the weekend, I applied for a loan to tide me over until I got paid. Now that I was in full-time employment, the banks and credit card companies were only too happy to help me. On Monday morning, I arrived at the archive with a spring in my step. Dr. Miller told me that I had a new task as the elevator took us deeper into the archive. The corridor that we stepped out onto was shorter and led to a single shutter door that slid up when Dr. Miller pressed his keycard against the reader. A light flickered on automatically as we stepped through the door into a vast open space. At first sight, it looked to me to hold scrap metal. There were dozens of large, dark remnants laid out before us. Maybe of vehicles, maybe of some kind of aircraft. I didn't know. As I followed Dr. Miller deeper into the space, I saw that the remnants were getting larger. The edges of some looked sheared off. Others appeared to be crushed in places. I got the feeling that I was looking at the results of crashes. Fast, violent collisions from the damage visible. Once again, I had plenty of questions, but I kept my own console and hoped my supervisor would explain. We had been walking for about 10 minutes, though, and Dr. Miller was saying nothing. Remnants now towered above us, their geometry seeming stranger to me by the minute. We stopped alongside one massive dark slab. It was sleek and circular and seemed to be complete. I was transfixed by it and had forgotten Dr. Miller was there until he cleared his throat and said, "Some of the things stored here date back to the earliest days of the archive. The object that we're looking at was acquired in the late 1950s. It was measured and photographed for our records at the time." He opened up his briefcase, took out a small device, and added, "I would like you to use this 3D handheld scanner so that a digital image of the object can now be created. Oh, it's nothing complicated. You point and press." As Dr. Miller handed over the scanner and then headed off deeper into the space without further explanation, I looked at the scanner and hoped that he was right. I pressed a button and a panel on top of the scanner lit up green, and I went for it. There were no joints or openings in the outer surface that I could see as I made a circuit of the object. There were no markings either. I got the feeling again that this was some kind of aircraft. A high-tech, latest-generation spy plane or drone, perhaps. And then I remembered that Dr. Miller had said this object was from the 1950s, but it looked far too advanced. I kept puzzling over what this thing was and kept scanning it until the light on top of the scanner had started flashing red. I had no idea why, but assumed it was because there was a problem with the scanner. I tried tapping it and then turning it off and on again. The red light kept flashing. Having exhausted my technical expertise, I decided the best thing to do was go find Dr. Miller. I set off walking the way that he had gone. There were more mysterious remnants scattered around, and I could also see lengths of tarps draped over the floor here and there. I knew that I should ignore them. I knew that if I did, my life would be simpler. I could find Dr. Miller, get the scanner working again, and finish my work for the day and go home. Maybe I could stop off in a bar on the way and have a cold beer. Maybe flirt with the waitress. But curiosity got the better of me. I stopped by the end of a length of tarp. I saw that it was very dusty, as if it hadn't been moved in a long while. I leaned over and lifted the end of it with one hand. There was a box underneath. It was about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. The top of the box was made of a clear material, and inside of it was a skeleton. My first thought was that I had stumbled across human remains, and then, as the initial jolt of shock had passed, I saw that the proportions of the skull were all wrong for a person. The cranium was enlarged, and the eye sockets were also way too big. I remembered images that I had seen on late-night TV shows with small budgets and words like unexplained and phenomena in the title. They were enjoyable but trashy and completely made up. Or so I had always believed until now. I stared at the bones. I thought about the complete craft and the remnants, and about the period from 1947 through the 1950s. It was the golden age for alien encounters and UFOs. With all sorts of crazy ideas swirling around inside me and buzzing with excitement, I hauled the rest of the tarp off. I swore under my breath. There was another box the same dimensions as the first one, and it had that same clear top, but this time there was flesh on the bone. The body inside had gray skin. The gray was very light in tone, and the skin wrinkled. The head was once again enlarged. The long, wide eyes at its base were closed. I would have given anything to have seen them open for me, to have the chance to communicate with what I was convinced was an alien. But from the state that it was in, I could tell that I was staring at a corpse. I covered it back up. I didn't want to look at the bodies anymore. I also didn't want to admit that I had been snooping. So I decided straight off that I was not going to say anything about the bodies to Dr. Miller or to the waitress at the bar, to which I was definitely going to go after work, because man, did I need a drink now. I wiped cold sweat from my face and turned away. I could hear footsteps and saw Dr. Miller wandering towards me. "Problem?" he asked. I almost did blurt out the truth, but managed to hold back and just told him that the scanner seemed to be acting up. He frowned then and said, "Oh, I'll take it to a technician later to be fixed. In the meantime, come with me. There's a lot to do, and not enough people to do it." I was happy to follow him and get out of there. Dr. Miller continued to be friendly but distant over the days that followed, and thankfully, I had no more disturbing encounters. By the end of the first month, I had told myself that there was likely a mundane explanation for the bodies in the boxes. They were props from an old movie or fakes from a traveling carnival. The so-called spacecraft and the rest would be something similar. I just hadn't thought what yet. At the time, I was also busy spending my first paycheck. I paid installments on money that I owed, and then bought myself some snazzy new clothes and went out and had a good time. The next Monday morning found me stumbling into work, trying to remember where I had been and what I had done. I was hoping for a quiet and uneventful day. Dr. Miller greeted me and dashed my hopes, though. "We are very happy with your work so far. I am pleased to be able to give you your own key card. I hope the responsibility won't go to your head." He chuckled as he handed over the key card, while the only thing that happened in my head was a new stab of pain. "Now, let's get to work," he added far too brightly. I trapezed after him to an elevator, and we descended into the archive deeper than we had before. The elevator shuddered to a halt. The doors opened, and we stepped out into what looked to me like the hallway into an apartment building. There was worn light brown carpet and a series of doors on either side. Each had a small laminated number fixed to the outside. There were buzzers of peepholes. It felt old and run down and unsettling. Dr. Miller seemed fine, though. He was opening the nearest apartment door and going in. Not sure what else to do, I went after him. I found myself in a small living room. There was a TV on in the corner, showing a game show. The TV and the game show both looked to be about 40 years old. There was an angle poise lamp resting on a table placed next to a recliner. They had all seen better days, as had the man slumped on the recliner. He was middle-aged and wore a white vest that was covered in stains at best left unidentified. His exposed shoulders and the top of his back and chest were covered in thick, gray matted hair. His fat gut hung over an undone belt below which he was wearing baggy shorts. His feet were bare and filthy.